UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Oh my goodness.
Well, now we have Ken
That
up.
worked.
Let's leave Ken up.
Surprised me.
I was like, wait a minute, there's Ken.
Well, we're doing this very, very different tonight.
Yeah.
I was about to sing your praises. For people who don't know who Ken Gerhard is, I might mispronounce your name. I always say Gerhard, but I think Kenny Irish always says Gerhard, and he probably knows whenever.
No, it's Gerhard.
Oh, okay. I got it right then.
Yeah.
Huh, there you go. Second guessing myself. Should never second guess yourself. Well, I was about to sing your praises and do an introduction, and I'm sure almost everybody on the planet who's into this kind of stuff knows who you are. I mean, you've been on this incredible range of TV shows, from Missing in Alaska to Monster Quest to everything in between. You've written so many books on cryptozoology. It's not funny. We had you on last year for the Essential Guide to Bigfoot, which, if people haven't read that, like the book we're about to talk about tonight, I think it's the greatest just overview of the Bigfoot topic I've ever read. It's just everything's in there. Whether you know a lot about it or not, it's fantastic. Anyway, what we're talking about tonight is it almost feels like the follow-up book in a way, because it's in a series, because this one's the Essential Guide to the Loch Ness Monster and Other Aquatic Cryptids. And it has that same feel to it. It was a book that, when I was reading it, there's obviously things that I knew. There was a lot of stuff in it that I didn't know. I loved how, again, whether you were new to the field of the Loch Ness Monster and aquatic cryptids, or you never had read anything about it before, it seemed to me that everything must be covered in that book. It seems like you just did this incredible overview. So perhaps before we ask you I know Jen has a few questions, but how did you research this? This must have taken you forever to put together.
Well, as I mentioned in the book, my first experience at Loch Ness was back in 1982 when I was only 15. So that my father and I went on a fishing trip there, and I was already interested in cryptozoology at that point. So my mother arranged that specifically for me, I think. And so, I attempted field research at a young age of course, I was young. I had a little movie camera, and I interviewed people around the lake. But, it's been a topic I've investigated for years. I've done lake monster research throughout North America, Canada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Texas, and other places. And I think that's relevant because I think the Loch Ness Monster is related to some other lake monsters around the world. They all seem very similar. Nessie, of course, is the most famous of those. But in the course of, when I decided to write the book, I'd always wanted to write a book about aquatic cryptids, and it just seemed like a natural follow-up for Bigfoot. Nessie, of course, is right up there in the pantheon of cryptids, and similar to the Bigfoot book, I interviewed many of the leading investigators in the field, and very fortunate to know many of them. And I also feel like I had access to some of the best information in terms of, the seminal books that kind of were written by the most scientific investigators through the years and stuff like that. So it just kind of all culminated in, I lovingly refer to it as a pandemic project, because I literally started it as soon as the pandemic hit. I was like, oh, good Lord, I'm going to be stuck inside for months. So a perfect time to start a book. And
Definitely.
So, and it also kind of kept me sane, having something to kind of focus on and stuff. But so the first two chapters are about Nessie, and as I kind of suggest, it kind of branched out from there into some of these other famous lake monsters around the world.
And you have, is Steve Feltham? I always mispronounce his name as well. I think, is it Feltham or Feltham?
I've always heard it pronounced Feltham.
Yeah, that's probably right, Feltham. But you got him to write the foreword, and he's been a character I've always been fascinated with. Somebody who just parked themselves. How long's he been at Loch Ness for?
Over 30 years.
Good grief. And he's just parked there, isn't he? Like he's essentially got a camper there or something. And he just watches that lake.
Yeah, he quit his, he had, like me, he had visited Loch Ness as a youth, and of course he was he's English, so he was a lot closer than I was. But about 30 years ago, so the story goes, he quit his boring desk job and decided to move to Loch Ness. And he's got a little research van parked out there by the loch, and for 30 plus years he's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest vigil at Loch Ness. For over 30 years now he's been right there, binoculars in hand, telescope, cameras, and of course he does he makes little Nessie sculptures that he sells from his research van to the tourists. And so he'd never, he's kind of an icon or a hero in the Nessie sphere. And I reached out to him, and because I realized didn't think he'd ever written a book. So I reached out to him. I asked him, "Have you ever been published?" And he said, "Well, I've written one article, but that's it." So I thought, well, would you honor me with a forward for this book? And of course, I sent him a draft first, so he could, make sure that he was, he was cool with everything, and he was. So it was quite an honor.
Oh, no, I love how you got Peter Byrne to do the Bigfoot book, and you got Steve to do this one. You get the best people writing it forwards. By the way, before I throw it to Jen to ask a couple of questions, but the teenage boy or even the prepubescent boy in me would have been so jealous that somebody else got to go to Loch Ness on an expedition with their dad, because I grew up in the 70s on In Search Of and Mysterious Monsters docos and all that stuff. And to me as a child, Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster were just two of the most iconic things on the entire planet, I think.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. In Search Of was my show growing up. I loved that. I couldn't wait for Saturdays to check out those episodes. And the 70s, of course, was very influential in the field of cryptozoology. A lot of Bigfoot, a lot of Loch Ness Monster, and other things like that were, like you said, were being featured on those shows. So
I think that must be such a trip for you too, because you would have, like me, you would have got to have seen John Green and Peter Byrne and all those kind of people on those documentaries. And now the next generation is going to look back and see Ken Gerhard on all of these documentaries.
Oh, that's humbling. Those guys are all my heroes. So I don't know what to say. I feel that's a great sense of humility, but thank you. And I try to bring much like with the Bigfoot book, I try to bring a lot of those older names back so that people know about Roy Mackal and Tim Dinsdale and, Robert Rines, and even going back to the 30s and Rupert T. Gould, guys that investigated the Loch Ness Monster back in the day. I mean, they were the heroes, the pioneers that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to, because they amassed so much good information, interviewed many of the original eyewitnesses and so forth. So,
what other aquatic creatures do you talk about in your book?
Well, of course, I mention all the rock stars, such as Champ, the monster of Lake Champlain in upstate New York, Vermont, and Quebec. Ogopogo, Canada's leading lake monster there out in Lake Okanagan, British Columbia. Flessie, or the Flathead Lake Monster from Montana, is pretty well known. Tessie, you're going to notice a trend here as I go through these names. They're all kind of based on Nessie. But Tessie in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, and then several around the world that are probably lesser known. There's one called Morag, which lives in a lake very close by to Loch Ness, up there in Scotland. It's seems very similar. And then I also have a chapter dedicated to quote unquote sea serpents, which were really the original cryptids dating back to the 19th century. Before cryptozoology, there was something called romantic zoology. And there were these colorful zoologists like Philip Henry Goss and, Francis Buckland, and some of these guys, Anton Cornelis Oudemans, that were writing about these sightings of monsters in the sea that were all, they're called sea serpents, but I don't think they're necessarily serpents or snakes or reptiles, but they have a serpentine body, similar to what the Loch Ness Monster really represents as well. So I tried to, there were so many that I couldn't get to, though. I mean, there are a lot of like really obscure lake monsters. And if you travel around, for example, the United States, each state, you'll hear about, you know, kind of a more obscure lake monsters. But again, the similarities are very compelling.
Yeah.
There's a lake to the south of me. I don't think there's meant to be a monster in it anymore, but it's it used to have a monster in it, supposedly. A lake called Devil's Lake down near Baraboo in the south of Wisconsin. And and it reminded me when I was reading some of the other Native American lore in your book about traditions of, you know, if you didn't leave maybe, you know, a pig for the monster or something, it would, you know, upend your canoe and maybe eat you. Or there's a couple of stories from Devil's Lake. One was involving, I think, a number of Native American men back in the day traveling across, I think, the lake, who their boat got upturned and they had all kinds of problems, which sounded very familiar to those other Native American stories. But there was also one fascinating story from Devil's Lake, was supposedly in a dry season when the lake went down, the natives saw a strange creature that was kind of stuck on a sandbank in the middle. But it's an interesting tale. I love that your book touches on Native American lore as well with these things, that the length of the tradition of some of these creatures is absolutely fascinating, actually.
Well, thank you. Yeah. You know, most of our cryptids tend to have a kind of a mythology that dates back, you know, far earlier than the quote unquote Western science, you know, would like to admit. But you have Native American legends, as you mentioned, of what were known as horned serpents. And so again, serpent-like animals, you know, not sure what to make of the reports of them having horns, but that seems to be a familiar motif as you travel around to a lot of the North American lakes with these lake monsters. And, you know, but that also pertains to Scotland as well, because, you know, the ancient Gaelic people and the Picts and some of the people that were in Scotland centuries ago had these legends of water kelpies, which were, you know, kind of shape-shifting water beasts that lived in some of the lochs and burns. And, yeah, and to me that adds like another layer of credibility to cryptids when you have not only a lot of modern sightings and reports that are very consistent, but then you go back and you find, you know, in different native traditions or Aboriginal folklore, you find stories that date back centuries. So, you know, to me that indicates that there could be something there. I mean, people have been seeing these things for a long, long time. So
I like those similarities, which are really drawn out in your book as well, across different reports. One example is the amount of times you hear a witness talk about the creature having a horse-like head.
Yeah, that is a similar thing. Now, there are slight variations on that. And again, I mentioned the water kelpie, which is, you know, the primary depiction of the water kelpie is an aquatic horse-like animal or horse-like head. But that is a common recurring theme. And as I said, there are slight variations. So some people say the head is sheep-like or camel-like, and then sometimes even snake-like, but less frequently you hear that. But, you know, if you think about it, the shape of a snake's head, you know, a gigantic snake could actually be very horse-like too, in terms of having a flat cranium and so on and so forth. So yeah, isn't that interesting? So we're talking about the general archetype we're talking about is an animal at least 20 up to 40 feet long, very slender, serpentine body, horse-like head, smooth skin like a whale is what most people describe, not scaly necessarily. You don't hear the scale descriptions too much. Usually a dark color, black or dark green or brown or gray, dark gray, with a light underbelly. People often say the back is darker and the underbelly is lighter. And a fluke tail, or a horizontal tail like a whale has, as opposed to a fish's tail, which is vertical. So, and even, you know, we talked about the horse heads, and, you know, less frequently we also talked about the descriptions of horns on the head, but occasionally you hear descriptions of a mane of hair running down the back, and even whiskers or vibrissae. So, you know, what's interesting to me is that the picture we're sort of painting here really describes, these are all mammalian characteristics. They don't have anything to do with a reptile or a prehistoric dinosaur or, you know, a fish. To me, they all sound like a mammal. And of course, that's something that I, you know, tried to underscore in the book.
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted spoilers or not, so I didn't know if I wanted to get to the gist of
No.
what
Sorry.
you're kind of. No, I didn't know if you wanted audience to know. Are you happy to talk about that, about the hypothesis of what you think?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
It's gotten out there in all places. The Inverness Courier, which is the Scottish newspaper that launched the Loch Ness Monster back in May of 1933, ran an article on my book, and I think Steve Feltham played a role in that, which I'm appreciative for. But they mentioned my theory, which is that, and this, I shouldn't say my theory because I didn't come up with this. It's been around for a while, but I think the leading candidate, in my opinion, if the Loch Ness Monster exists, the leading candidate would be something that descended from an ancient line of whales, cetaceans known as archaeocetes or basilosaurs. And a lot of people don't realize this, but about 40 million years ago during the Oligocene, you had these primitive whales that were very long and slender. They had a very long vertebral column, and they didn't look at all like modern whales. And they allegedly died out 25 million years ago during the Miocene. But, you know, the descriptions to me are you know, very similar to what people are describing in modern, you know, like humps, vertical undulations is, I think, the key thing. You think about fish and reptiles swim from side to side. Only mammals go up and down, that type of flexion, like otters and seals. And so, you know, even whales. So I don't know. I mean, you know, I certainly, it's all speculation, just like with Bigfoot and Sasquatch and any other cryptid. We're just educated speculators, but, you know, in my opinion, at least, I know a lot of people have this romantic attachment to the notion of a plesiosaur, which is the marine saurian from the Mesozoic era that had that long neck and a small head. But those descriptions are rare. You know, only 15% of the time do people actually describe this little head and long neck coming out of the water. 85% of the time, it's just big humps kind of undulating through the water. So
no, your book has a lot of those descriptions with that undulating type of movement. And I think that plesiosaur description, and it makes me sad to kind of discard it as well, even though I don't really think there's a plesiosaur in Loch Ness. That's what I always imagine, I think, as so many people do. But I think a lot of that does probably, and I'm sure you agree, probably dates to the surgeon's photo, because that's such an iconic imagery, or an iconic image which got burnt into people's heads, I think, when they think about Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the iconic image of the Loch Ness Monster. And the plesiosaur candidate actually dates back before that. If you go back to the sea serpents we were talking about a moment ago, back in the 1861, Philip Henry Goss, who was a naturalist, wrote books about these sea serpents, and he was one of the first ones to suggest that it could be a plesiosaur, that these sea serpents might be surviving plesiosaurs. And maybe even before that, I think in 1848, there was a sea serpent sighting, and there was a scientist or a zoologist that came out. And you got to keep in mind that the 1800s was a big boon for paleontology, because that's when dinosaur fossils were finally recognized for what they were. And there were a number of plesiosaur fossils that were found in the United Kingdom. So places like Dorset and so forth. So, the plesiosaur theory, you know, people, again, the iconic image of the surgeon's photo, I don't think it's any great revelation that that's been proven to be a hoax, or probably a hoax. There are still some cryptozoologists that dispute that and think it's authentic. But, you know, again, you don't get a lot of those types of, the image of the you know, I'm trying to do it with my hand here. You know, the little head, you know, head and the long neck. You know, people think of that particular photo, the surgeon's photo, which was taken in 1934, and it's just kind of imprinted in our mind. It's shown on every TV show and lots of books, and it wasn't revealed to be a hoax until the 1990s. So, and still a lot of people don't know that happened. So, but yeah, and there have been leading Nessie investigators like Tim Dinsdale was a leading proponent. He was a guy that was there for many years, and he thought, based on the interviews that he had done, that the Nessie was probably a plesiosaur. He also had a zoologist named Sir Peter Scott, who also was on board with that. So, that was a theory, and there's still people that think that, but some people think Nessie is a giant eel. Some people think it might be a big catfish. Some people think it might be an amphibian. So there are lots of different theories. But I think that based on the eyewitness descriptions, I really think that this archaeocete theory is the most probable.
And do you think that enters Loch Ness via the River Ness or something and then comes and goes? Or
yeah, I mean and I think that holds true for all of the lake monsters, because Loch Ness is connected to the ocean via, rivers and canals. So is Lake Champlain. So is Lake Okanagan. There are a lot of rivers that kind of come in from the ocean, and there are salmon that make those runs from the ocean, and all of those lakes. So I think that the fact that you have these sea serpent sightings in the ocean for so many centuries, and they're similar to the lake monsters, to me, it's an obvious conclusion that it's the same animal and that they're traveling into fresh water and back out to the ocean, similar to salmon and sturgeon and eels and other types of fish, but also similar to whales. There are modern accounts of whales getting into, the St. Lawrence River and the Thames River, and, they can sometimes come up into rivers and lakes. So, that it's a theory. But, that would explain also why, the Loch Ness monster isn't seen more often, or some of these lake monsters aren't seen more often. Maybe they're not full-time inhabitants of the lochs. Maybe they're just visitors,
I do think it's a really good working theory. As you know, I think we've talked before, I tend to have a Keelian perspective on a lot of cryptids, but the type of cryptids I'm always more likely to think maybe are some kind of relic or an undiscovered critter are things that live in the oceans, because, we all know the amount of surface that oceans cover, how deep they are, how unexplored they are. So I think when we start to look at those monsters that have, or those creatures that have the potential to get to a loch or a lake via a river and the sea, then you don't need to perhaps go down as an esoteric path as I would normally be predisposed to with a Sasquatch or something. When I have difficulty explaining how a Sasquatch is seen up the road from me, I don't have that kind of difficulty explaining how something's seen off the coast of Greenland or the coast of Maine or the coast of, and that's interesting too. Your book actually talked about this North Atlantic type of area, which extends up to, I suppose, towards Scandinavia and to the UK and to the east coast of America up high. Did you want to talk a little bit about that kind of space as well? I found that interesting. I never read that before, as far as putting it all together.
Yeah. So if you had a map of the world in front of you, or at least starting in the Atlantic Ocean, I mentioned the sea serpents. The first accounts of sea serpents date back to the Norwegian coast, the fjords off the coast of Norway, like in the 15th century and around that time period, 18th century. And so that's in the North Atlantic. And then you have a famous sea serpent sighting off the coast of Greenland in the 16th century. Then you have a lot of sightings of sea serpents off the coast of New England on the other side of the Atlantic, on the western side there. And then the lake monsters are all kind of there in that northern Atlantic region too, Loch Ness and Lake Champlain, Lake Okanagan, and all the monster lakes really in the northern hemisphere kind of fit into the same lines of latitude. I think it's like 30 to 50 degrees. They're all similar types of lakes. They're cold, glacial lakes that were carved out by the retreating glaciers at the end of the Pleistocene. And they're stocked with similar types of fish, salmon and trout, eels, things like that. As a cryptozoologist, and I always try to approach it from a zoological perspective, you know, the fact that you have similar habitats and similar water temperatures for all of these aquatic cryptids, to me, that's interesting, you know, because it seems to, forgive me, Dean, but it seems to stray away from a Keelian perspective when you have patterns and things like that that make a lot of sense in terms of zoology. You know, a species that was out there that was undiscovered would probably have a specific set of adaptations, like all species do, to a certain type of habitat. And you know, there are certain animals that have a worldwide range in the ocean, things like certain species of sharks and things like that. But then you have other species that are specific to certain water temperatures or certain layers in the ocean. You know, you have the pelagic fish and the benthic fish in the bottom and things like that. So, the North Atlantic. Now, there are some sightings in the Pacific as well, off the coast of British Columbia and going up to Alaska, down to the California coast. They're not as common though as the North Atlantic sightings. And then there are very few aquatic cryptids from the Southern Hemisphere, which is interesting, just a couple. So, again, it's you know, it's just another layer of circumstantial evidence. But when you're trying to make a case for an unknown animal, it's particularly something as remarkable as the Loch Ness Monster and its cousins, then you really have to, you know, add as much circumstantial evidence together as possible in lieu of physical evidence. So,
do you think with your hypothesis of it being a type of prehistoric whale or a descendant of a prehistoric whale, do you think that requires a different approach to looking for it than the traditional approaches which have been used in Loch Ness, or does it not really make any difference being more species specific as a zoologist?
Well, that's a good question. I think most of the critics and skeptics of my theory point to the fact that whales are air breathers, of course, and so they do come to the surface and spout and gulp air. But, you know, we were just talking a moment ago, and you pointed out that there are species in the oceans that are still potentially undiscovered. I think even the most conservative scientists will acknowledge that there could be large animals in the oceans we haven't seen yet because they're so incredibly deep, 12,000 feet deep on average, going down to 27, 30,000 feet in some places. But there are some of the newest discoveries out of the ocean are whales, and specifically what are known as beaked whales or zoophiids, which are whales that live at great depths. They're not as large as some of the whales that we know, like sperm whales and humpback whales and blue whales, but they're smaller, but they live at great depths, and they can actually hold their breath for a very long time. In fact, in 2017, they were able to monitor a specific species of beaked whale. An individual went down and held its breath for almost 4 hours before it came back to the surface. Wow. And it swam pretty deep. So, you know, if whales, some whales can hold their breath for hours, I guess that's the only way you could really make a case for these evolved archaeocetes, is that, you know, they are able to hold their breath and they stay pretty low down and don't come to the surface a lot. So in that respect, they would be harder to find. The plesiosaur, I think, would be the easiest to find because, you know, I think they would be coming to the surface to breathe more often, and that's always been one of the strongest arguments against the plesiosaur theory. But probably my second and third favorite theories, my second is that Nessie could be an amphibian. Amphibians are able to not only hold their breath, but they also can exchange oxygen through their skin. It's called cutaneous respiration. So an amphibian could literally plop down on the bottom of Loch Ness and hardly ever come to the surface. And then there's a really weird theory from the 1960s. This guy, Ted Holliday, proposed that maybe Nessie was a giant mollusk, basically a slug. So, you know, an invertebrate. And then it wouldn't, like a fish, it would have gills. It wouldn't have to come to the surface very often. So those are all kind of interesting. But, you know, one of the most common theories these days that a lot of my colleagues embrace is that Nessie is just a giant eel, which I'm not really sold on that whole hypothesis for a number of reasons. But who knows? You know, that's one of the great parts of the mystery is that, you know, that we still have, just like a great Agatha Christie novel, you still have all these great suspects that you can kind of like, who done it, you know?
I think something you point out in the book too, speaking about it being an eel, is not just in that case, but in others, how quickly the media is to jump to a conclusion when they have a little bit of evidence. So when that DNA test came back in 2018 or whenever it was, when the scientists were testing the waters, and there was a lot of eel DNA, of course, the headlines are like, you know, mystery of Loch Ness solved, it's a giant eel. And you talked about actually a documentary I've seen, and it's so ridiculous, a documentary, that BBC documentary where they do an experiment where they have this, I don't know, like this big piece of 2x4 or a telegraph pole, and they kind of anchor it to the bottom so it bobs up and down, and they try to trick people into thinking that and they somehow think that's proof that that's what people have been seeing. I don't think anybody that they show it to goes, oh, I thought we saw the monster. You know, they were all like, yeah, it was a piece of wood. And then it wraps that show, well, we've discovered the secret of the Loch Ness monster. It's like, come on.
Yeah, that's been a recurring theme, you're right, in the British newspapers and certain documentaries where they like to be the ones that, well, okay, we solved it, this is what it is. You're right, that was pretty silly. They had this, like you said, it was like a fence post, and it was just bobbing up and down the water, and they tried to get, you know, some unsuspecting tourists, you know, to bite, and none of them thought it looked like a monster. They're like, what does that look like? Well, it's mechanical. It looks like a tube or something, you know. So yeah, that's been a constant thing where they've kind of come out and declared, as you mentioned, the eDNA study that spanned from 2018 and 2019. That was conducted by a guy named Neil Gemmell, who was a geneticist from New Zealand. And they didn't find any reptile DNA. So they came out and said, well, look, we don't think it's a plesiosaur. They did find a lot of eel DNA. So that was kind of the theory of the hour. But, you know, there have been similar, you know, just recently there was a scientist that came out that said he thought Nessie was a giant turtle. And a few years ago, Steve Feltham, in fact, proposed that maybe Nessie was a giant catfish called a Wells catfish. Huh. So, you know, it seems like they're kind of cyclical. Different theories kind of, forgive the pun, they surface and resurface, and then they submerge and come back again. So, but you know, the interesting thing about the DNA study, and I think it's wonderful that they did the study, and certainly it gives hope for future findings. But there was only 25% of the DNA that was extracted from their samples, 250 samples from around the loch, was unidentified. So they were only able to identify 75% of the DNA. So that always kind of gives a little loophole to cryptozoologists like me to say, well, you know, it's not 100% conclusive. They didn't find any DNA of either otters or seals in their study, which are animals that are known to come into Loch Ness. And also, apparently, DNA is only viable in water for, you know, maybe a few weeks. Since an specific animal had contact with that water. So, you know, again, if Nessie is something that travels in and out of to Loch Ness from the ocean, then, you know, maybe they just missed her. You know, who knows?
Yeah, that's a good point. When you were mentioning those other theories about it maybe being a mollusk or an amphibian or something, I suppose that in a way ties in with some of those early reports where people claim to actually see some kind of creature cross a roadway or something in front of them as well.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, in fact, the most famous land sighting, and there are about 35 land sightings of Nessie through the decades, which isn't very much in my opinion. So I'm skeptical of those. But one of the most famous ones that a lot of people have heard about is the Spicers, George Spicer and his wife. He was a London businessman. They were on holiday and they were driving their little, whatever it was, Model T alongside the loch in July of 1933, July 22nd of 1933 in the afternoon. And they saw this thing come across the road and they described it as an abomination, loathsome and repulsive. And they said it had a wormy, creepy, crawly look to it. And it was kind of slithering across the road, and then bounded down into Loch Ness. So that's one of the sightings that, and other people have described it as having a creepy look to it, to the skin and stuff. So, yeah, but I think you could also make a pretty strong argument against that, because mollusks are not very fast. Well, maybe in the water, but on land, I mean, they don't have a backbone, or they don't have bones, so they don't have that ability to kind of use that skeletal structure to exert a lot of speed and inertia. So if there was a 30-40 foot slug, I mean, I don't think you would see it shoot across the road. It seems like it would be kind of lumbering, right? So I don't know, but yeah, the land sightings, and an excellent Nessie investigator named Roland Watson has written a book about all the land sightings of Nessie, but there haven't been really any recent ones. I think there was one he talked about a few years ago that was kind of vague, but most of the alleged land sightings of Nessie took place in the 1930s, and then again, some in the 40s and 60s, I think. So to me, in the big picture, I don't think it moves the needle much.
Yeah, to rewind to an earlier topic we were talking about briefly when we were chatting about the surgeon's photo, there's probably another photo that reminds me an awful lot of that, and that's a photo which hasn't been really debunked, I don't think, and that's the Sandra Mancy photo. What's your take on that? I know you talk about it a little in the book. Yeah,
the Mancy photo is considered by many cryptozoologists to be the best still photograph of a lake monster. It was taken around July 4th, 1977 by a woman named Sandra Mancy, who, along with her family, were vacationing kind of up in that area. They were on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain, on the northern end. And they basically just parked alongside the loch and were walking down to the shore. The kids were playing in the water, and according to Sandra, she saw this thing rise out of well, first she saw the water churning, and then she saw this thing rise up out of the water, and she said it, looked just like the thing in the surgeon's photo, or a plesiosaur. It had the small head, the long neck, and a kind of a hump. And right about that time, after she'd been looking at this thing for a couple of minutes, her then fiance returned from the car with a camera, and so he saw it and freaked out, and they yelled at the kids to get out of the water, and she had the wherewithal to snap one photo of this thing on this little Kodak Instamatic camera before they took off. They were terrified, and they didn't know if they should tell anybody. They were going to report this thing. It looked like a dinosaur, is what she said. Or the early joke was a 2,000-pound duck. That's what that was kind of like the inside joke in her family. But they decided that they didn't want to be considered, kind of, even if they had a photograph, they didn't want to kind of be connected to any weirdness like the Lake Champlain monsters. So she kept the photo in a family photo album until, I forget how much longer it was, maybe a couple years later. One of her co-workers was talking about the Ness, going to Loch Ness, and he was into the monster story, and that's when she brought the photograph to work and showed him. And then it wasn't long before it got into the hands of cryptozoologists, and it ultimately appeared, I think it was in the New York Times and maybe Time Magazine, and it was in a lot of publications around 1979, 1980. So yeah, it's never been fully debunked. Now, one of my colleagues, Ben Radford, who's a friend of mine, but he's also a skeptic, he thinks that it's not a monster at all, but it's just this weird shaped piece of driftwood or something, or a rotted tree that came out of the water and was bobbing up and down. And because the photo's not super, you can't see like eyes and teeth or anything like that. But it is compelling. It looks like the surgeon's photo, but it looks better. It looks like you can see the distance from the shore, and it appears to be very large. But sadly, like all alleged photos and videos of the Loch Ness monster and other lake monsters, it's just not that concrete, empirical evidence that we need to prove to scientists and the world that these things exist.
When I was reading your book in a number of places, actually, and I really enjoyed it, by the way. I'm serious. I can't recommend it highly enough for anybody with any kind of interest in this topic. But when I was reading it, sometimes, of course, my Keelian hat falls on, even if I'm not trying to put it on. I can't help myself. And even I go sometimes beyond that. I go to weirder levels of esotericism in some of when I start to think about some of these type of things. And what I didn't know about the Mansi photo, I mean, I'm not an expert by any means in this field. I'm interested in all kinds of cryptids, but I'm no expert. I didn't know that she'd lost the negative. And I didn't know that she supposedly either couldn't remember or didn't know where the location was. She could take nobody to the spot where she'd snapped the photo from. And that didn't make me instantly go, oh, well, it's a hoax. What it made me do, along with another story in the book about two people who'd recorded, and I forget what lake it was in. I'm sure you'll remember and be able to help me out. They recorded a monster and it reared up and it looked, you could actually see its head, and they sold it to a news channel. But in the meantime, they'd inadvertently somehow deleted the main bit of the film when the footage showed the actual head rear up.
Yeah, that's frustrating. Yeah, that's the Kelly Nash video that was shot up in Alaska. Right there off, I forget the name of the Huichak River, I think. Or actually, there's a big bay there that connects the Huichak River to Lake Iliamna. But yeah, there was a family out there fishing in 2009, and they saw some serpentine, sea serpent type animals being chased by beluga whales, and they got out their little camcorder and filmed it. And the footage, they eventually sold the footage to a Discovery Channel, I think. And they aired it on a special about actually some of the guys from the Deadliest Catch. I think we're trying to do a separate show about investigating Alaskan mysteries. I can't remember. Sorry, I'm not a huge Deadliest Catch fan, but if you watch the show, it's some of the main guys. But according to one of my colleagues, John Kirk, who's a brilliant cryptid investigator from British Columbia, he went up with a guy named Paul LeBlanc, another cryptozoologist, and they saw the footage, and they said they could and on top of the rolling humps, the signature rolling humps, they actually saw a horse-like head come out of the water and turn and look at the camera. And so they were pretty blown away by that. But when the footage finally aired on the TV show, that particular clip didn't make it into the show, just the humps. And so John Kirk did a follow-up investigation to find out why, the network didn't show the most convincing moment of that footage. And what he found out was that the Nash family apparently recorded over some of the lake monster footage on the camcorder before they turned it over to the network, which you think, it's like one of those things in cryptozoology where, the body vanishes and the remains are missing, and the vital piece of evidence, the vital clue. So I guess it kind of makes the field look bad at times, but it is still, the humps look very convincing. And an even more recent version of that, which I write about in the book, is the Blake Newdorf footage at Lake Okanagan, which was shot in 2018. This young man fishing with his dad, and they captured this thing crawling on the surface of the water, and it's the classic vertical undulations. It looks like a big caterpillar. It's not a wave effect. There have been a lot of lake monster videos that have been debunked as just wave patterns, standing waves that look like, but that you can tell they're very symmetrical and they have a very repetitive rhythm. This thing was clearly a big animal, like a big caterpillar, inchworm going across the surface of the water. And he filmed it for like a minute until it disappeared beyond this outcrop. And we featured this footage on a recent show called The Proof Is Out There on History Channel. And I commented that this is some of the most compelling lake monster video that I've seen. And much to my surprise and chagrin, they had a marine biologist come on to give her opinion. And she said, that looks like a real animal. It's a living animal. And so that was the conclusion of that particular clip, is that, this could be something unknown. So who knows? Maybe, maybe we'll get, hopefully that's a sign that we'll get better and better photographic evidence now that there are more people with good cameras on their phones and, on the standby.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the esotericist in me descends again. When I read about the stories like the erasure or the footage or Sandromancy losing the negative or the capture of a creature and then the remains are discarded even though it's unlike anything anyone else has ever seen, or the Minnesota Iceman, or any of these things where we almost have that that smoking gun and then it kind of evaporates. It doesn't make me doubt cryptozoology, or it doesn't make me doubt that people are necessarily telling the truth. It makes me see it within some kind of weird mythic structure where the final piece of the puzzle is always withheld. So we can keep on believing and we can stay in this liminal space. Is it real? Isn't it real? Is it real? Isn't it real? And not just in cryptozoology, incidentally. I think that applies through the broader paranormal realm, like in UFO research and in specter hunting. We've almost got we don't have it. It's so strange. And to me, it's almost like some myth is constantly being played out. And I know there's nothing we can prove, but it's always something that just, when I read things like that, it just tweaks me every time.
Well, that's cool. Okay, so since we're on this topic, and I typically don't diverge from the traditional zoology, but I've got kind of a far out theory that I was thinking about today, since you're into the Keelian stuff, and I'll kind of drop this on you. Hopefully I can abbreviate this so it's not too protracted. But so I'm a volunteer at the San Antonio Zoo. Right now we're doing a dragon exhibit. It's called Dragon Forest. So we have these 16 life-sized animatronic dragons. They're pretty cool, dragons from all over the world. And I'm out there doing presentations and tours and interpreting the dragon mythologies from around the world. Well, there's a cultural anthropologist named David Jones that wrote an interesting book a few years ago where he proposed that these dragon legends all over the world basically are an inherited instinct that all humans have, that date back, that have literally been passed down from generation to generation for millions of years, that date back to our pre-human ancestors in Africa millions of years ago. The three main predators that fed on our ancestors were big snakes, like pythons, big cats like leopards and lions, and eagles. And most of the dragons around the world combine their chimeras that combine the features of snakes, wings, and cat-like features. Mm-hmm. And I would add to the mix something like a competitive ape man, because our pre-human ancestors were in competition with other species of early hominids. So think about those four archetypes. Now think about all the cryptids that are reported today. What are they? They're mainly like the man-beast type, like Bigfoot and Yeti, the lake monsters, which are all the big serpents, the flying things, which are like the eagles and the pterodactyls and Mothman, and then the big cats and the black panthers. So isn't it interesting? Wouldn't it be interesting if that all of these cryptids are actually thought projections that we are basically introducing into our modern reality because, we've inherited this instinct to see these things. It's like, because they're dangerous to us. And, a lot of people will think, well, no, what I saw was real. It was there. Well, your mind is not always capable of discerning, what is and isn't reality. And certainly, if you believe this whole theory of tulpa and thought projections, we're able to basically introduce things into our reality. So I don't know. It's a far out theory, and I don't necessarily know if I advocate it, but you could literally explain all the cryptids in the world as a cultural phenomenon if you buy into that fact that we've inherited that there are modern dragons essentially, and we're projecting them into our reality because we have this inherited instinct to see them.
I want to see that book from you next, Ken.
Yeah.
Monsters of the Mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's ready for you to write. That would be a major controversy if you wrote that, because you were one of the better known flesh and blood cryptozoologists out there. So can you imagine how offended so many people in the crypto field would be if you came out with this kind of Carl Sagan meets John Keel book? I'm sorry, I was talking over you. My apologies.
No, I was going to say, but here's the thing, and I pride myself. Yes, I am a traditional flesh and blood cryptozoologist. I really think there's strong physical evidence for things like Bigfoot and somewhat for the lake monsters. But, the thing about science is you have to remain as truly objective as possible. And theories and, beliefs are constantly being overturned and replaced as new discoveries are made. And so I think I would be remiss in my duty as an investigator if I were to completely rule out anything at this point. We don't know. That's the bottom line, is we don't have the answers. These are enduring mysteries that have lasted for hundreds and thousands of years. So, I just like, I guess what I'm saying is I like to keep an open mind. Who knows? But I, you know, certain cryptids make more sense to me as a viable thing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, lake monsters, maybe thunderbirds. Certain things like Mothman and the Jersey Devil and the Chupacabra are kind of more in that Keelian universe, and they just, you know, they're so bizarre that it's hard to approach those from a zoological angle.
Yeah.
But speaking of thunderbirds, my daughter is obsessed. She goes through cryptid phases. So it was the Loch Ness monster for a while. It's been Bigfoot. It's been Mothman. At the moment, it's thunderbirds, and she calls them lightning birds for some reason. But she's absolutely
they shoot lightning out of their eyes, supposedly.
Yeah.
Well, she was obsessed with ropens as well because they glow. They were a pterodactyl that glowed. So there was a period where she was really into ropens. But in fact, I told her I was talking to the man who wrote this book because she's quite obsessed with the Loch Ness monster still. And I said, I'm going to tell him that you like thunderbirds. And she seemed
awesome. I love thunderbirds. I just I actually spoke to an eyewitness yesterday and another one today. So people approaching me all the times with their sightings. So there's no physical evidence. There are Native American legends, traditions all over the continent, but I've interviewed dozens and dozens of very credible people that swear that they've seen these things. So, you know, where does that leave us?
In a very strange universe. Now, Jen, did you want to ask Ken anything before we wrap up? Because I've hogged this conversation.
Well, if I have a question, it's probably far off. I mean, I'm just kind of curious if you've ever researched any mythological creatures to where maybe they, you know, kind of meshed in with any of the cryptids. Like,
well, you know, mythological in terms of like real old mythology, because many of the cryptids do have a strong presence in mythology. You know, for example, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, Nessie and the water kelpie connection, thunderbirds, which we just discussed. You know, let's talk about dragons, since we mentioned those for a moment. So, you know, the first dragon in antiquity goes back to ancient Babylon, and it's known as Tiamat. And Tiamat, 4,000 years ago, the ancient Babylonians said that Tiamat was a giant serpent that lived in the ocean, that had a horse-like head, that basically, you know, was the personification of chaos. So that could be our very first clue to a Nessie-like creature. But one that's kind of really far out there that a lot of people don't talk about, I'm sure some of your listeners have heard of the Mokele Mbembe, which is the alleged African Apatosaurus dinosaur that lives deep in the Congo and West Africa. There was a famous archaeological expedition in the early 20th century that dug up the Sirush wall, which was this ancient Babylonian wall that had depictions of lions, oxen, and a dragon. And the dragon was known as it was the Ishtar, and the dragon was known as the Sirush. Got those confused. And it looks just like a Mokele Mbembe. It's like got a big body and a long neck and a small head and a long tail. And so for decades, cryptozoologists have been speculating that maybe there were living dinosaurs in Africa around the time of ancient Babylon, and that knowledge of those somehow made it to ancient Babylon. And so they were able, and may have even brought one along with them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a far out fun thing if you go back 4,000 years ago to ancient Babylon and the mythology of the Sirush and think, wow, maybe this was based on a real living animal, like a living dinosaur. It's pretty far out, and I don't know how probable it is, but it's kind of fun to think about.
We screened a documentary at Midwest Weird Fest called The Explorer by Alexandre Brachet, and he follows Michel. You probably know his name? Oh, Michel Lambot. Is that his name? Yeah,
Reynal.
I'm trying to remember. I think it's
he's a
He's a French, he's a
Yeah.
French. Yeah.
Michel
And they
Reynal.
go on the
Mhm.
quest for the Mekele Mbembe. It's a fascinating documentary.
Yeah, I know some other cats that have been there. Adam Davis, who's a friend of mine, has been there to Lake Telly. John Kirk and Bill Gibbons, a couple of Canadians, went up there one time. So I'm not brave enough for that one. I think I actually I had one time I had a guy that was willing to pay for it. He's like, Ken, I'm a cryptozoology enthusiast. I've got some money. You know, I want to pay for an expedition for the two of us to go look for Mekele Mbembe. And I was like, look, dude, you could die. I mean, you know, not that I'm afraid of field research, and not necessarily from the malaria or all the other horrible diseases that you might get when you're going into the jungle. But the stories I've heard about some of the guys like Adam and John Kirk that have gone there, I mean, they were, you know, they came across 14-year-old kids with machine guns that were high on drugs in the middle of the jungle, like quote unquote gorillas. You know, it's like, what do you do if you run into that kind of situation? So it's like, you know, it's pretty dangerous to go look for some of those cryptids.
We sure don't want to lose you, Ken. You're like a treasure of cryptozoology field. And I know you can get this book on Amazon, The Wonderful Essential Guide to the Loch Ness Monster and Other Aquatic Cryptids. But is it better if people who want to read it buy it directly from you, or how would you prefer they go about getting the book?
Well, I sell signed copies directly. If someone would like an autographed or personalized copy, they can reach out to me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a YouTube channel, a website, kengerhard.com. But it's, you know, it's also available on Amazon and around the world, Amazon marketplaces all over the world. And I'm very happy that the Nessie book is actually doing very well in the United Kingdom. I check my Amazon sales every day, and I guess it's to be expected because that's their national cryptid, and they're very proud of it. But that makes me feel pretty good that it's selling so well in the United Kingdom. But either way, people can buy it on Amazon, or if they want a signed copy, get in touch with me.
Well, it was wonderful having you back on Talking Weird. Write another book, particularly that weird Keelian Carl Sagan type one, so we can have you back on sometime soon. But yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming back to Talking Weird, Ken.
Guys, it was an honor and a pleasure to be with you again. Thank you so much for having me on. And thanks to everyone who listened in.
Thank you. Keep it weird, everybody.
Keep it weird.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.